Hey, Nathan, this is a group of Resonate Church pastors, primarily on college campuses. And man, we're big fans of yours, and we are excited to have you here. Hey, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and then hand it over to you. And so thanks again. We are so grateful that you had time to be able to add us to your schedule. So take it away, Nathan.
That's kind. Keith, thank you for the opportunity. I see about a dozen of you sitting around there in the room, and maybe this is the first session of the day. Maybe it's part of a longer, I heard, retreat schedule. So I don't assume on your time, but I am thankful for it. In just a minute, maybe I'll get you guys to just give me your name, where maybe you're church planting or ministering, how long you've been at it, okay? And I want to use the time to kind of maybe do an exercise to get to know you a little bit, but obviously give you a little bit of opportunity for questions and other things related to our context, but that does require a bit of framing. It's nice, very kind to say, I think the word you used was fans. That's great. And we're to the degree where you have the word of God in our hand, we're worth listening to. I hope that's okay, and I hope that lands well. If what we have to say isn't confirmed and demonstrable in the Word of God, take it or leave it. You're better off letting it be, leaving it. So by all means, the questions at any point, you can cause us to pause and cause me to pause, and we can open the Word and spend time there. If that's the takeaway, then it's worth the time. Okay. Carrie, my wife, and I, we live and work in South Asia. Came to South Asia when I was 24 as a single. Met my wife there. We've been married 22 years. Carrie's from Oklahoma. I'm from Missouri, so we're on our stateside assignment this fall, just outside of Oklahoma. Just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, excuse me. I was at 24 years old. That was the year 2000. So if you've done the math real quick, if you excel in that addition, I turned 48 this year in 2024. And which means we're celebrating a bit of a milestone, even with our extended family here. It's been half our lives focused on South Asian peoples. Had a little time to get married in the middle there, and for that matter, to attend a bit more theological education with my wife. But we've crossed 22 years with the Southern Baptist Convention. And our 4 kids raised on the field, all 4 of them born, having deployed as a couple soon after marriage. And they're trying to get used to homeschooling right now as we're in Oklahoma. So I just had a 16-year-old, 17, about to turn 17 next month, and driver's ed for the first time. Took a test the other day, and they're in Liberty Online right now. But our heart, our work, our life's work, as I'd consider it, particularly targeting Hindus in a pioneering setting. But we teach the Bible and we problem solve for church planting. To the degree we can discern controllables in the kingdom means that there are uncontrollables, things only God can do that we don't try to usurp or take on ourselves. The giving of life and the planting of a church being one. There are controllables in the matter of seed sowing and follow-up and disciple making and trusting leaders to Christ, even for the sake of exit at times. And so that's been our life's work. That's what we're up to. So what brings joy and lift? Meanwhile, for the last 7 years, we've been leading the South Asian Affinity. That's one of 7 affinities. So we currently lead 71 teams. By all means, maybe around the room, just raise your hand so I can pick out you in the crowd. Give me your name, shout it out. Maybe loud enough it'll come across. How long you've been working in the field, and what's your field of church planting? Is that okay to ask?
I go first. My name is Chris. Came to be part of Resonate Church 10 years ago. Trying to remember. I served in Pullman, Washington. I pastored Resonate Church in Pullman, Washington. Next call.
How's it going? I'm Colin. I have been in ministry for 9-10 years and serve as the pastor in Corvallis, Oregon.
Hey, I'm Jonathan. I've been in ministry with Resonate for 5 years. and then been with Resonate since 2015. And I serve as the pastor in Salt Lake City, Utah, University of Utah.
I'm Jordan. I've been in vocational ministry for about 6 or 7 years. And I just planted a church with a team in Grand Junction, Colorado about 9 months ago.
I've been in ministry for 7 years. Currently serve in Monmouth, Oregon.
Did you say Ben? Is that right?
Sure.
Okay, got it.
Hey, I'm Jacob. I've been with Resonate for, I think, about 15 years, 14 years or so. I'm in Seattle.
I'm Steven. I've been with Resonate for 5 years and I'm in Reno, Nevada.
My name is Preston. I've been a pastor for 6 years. I'm in Missoula, Montana. I'm Connor. Over here. I've been a part of Resonate for 5 years. The first chunk of that is a missionary in East Asia, and my wife and I are preparing to plant a church in Reading, England.
I'm Craig. I've been part of Resonate for about 15 years, and I lead our central support network.
I'm Matthew. Been with Resonate been doing campus ministry in Moscow, Idaho for 18 years. Been with Resonate for 17.
I'm Carson. I've been with Resonate for about 5 years now in ministry, and I'm in Chico, California.
And I'm Matt. I'm doing vocational ministry for 9 years and currently pastoring in Fort Collins, Colorado.
That's it.
Matt, have we met before in Fort Collins?
Think so. I've been there since 2022. So been
It's
there.
2022. All right. All right. It's a pleasure to be with you guys then. And I'll try to keep all the Collins separate. I think there's only two of them. One on the couch and one in the corner. Okay, I got it. Well, I'm going to actually try to do a couple things. If I were to say just to test and see where we're at as a group, as far as entry levels in our conversation, some of the terms we use. If I were to say, just anybody that can give me 1 minute on what is the core missionary task, anybody familiar with that, or for that matter, the 4 fields of kingdom growth? Anybody could give me a 1 minute overview of that? If you can give me a 1 minute overview, you save us the rest of the hour. How about that?
I think that's going to be a negative. I think we want to
Okay.
hear what to say on that.
Okay, good. Well, then I'm going to go to a little bit different thing. Let me try this. Keith, with your permission, just a 15 or 20 minute exercise to get to know the room for a second. I'm actually going to share my screen again. I'm going to show you a really, really high tech PowerPoint. Is that okay? Here it is.
That's perfect.
Yeah, all right. This is for the sake of a few questions, okay? Let me see if I can get to slideshow from the beginning. Look at this really high tech. Is that up on your screen now?
Yeah, we got it.
All right. Obviously, this is coming out of my journal this morning. For the sake of asking a few questions and getting to know the room a little bit, what I've got here is 4 basic church planning models. Now, you realize as soon as we go through these, every one of these, there's going to be nuances. And for that matter, at times, there's going to be overlap where the nuance might blend a couple of the models. But I want you to consider these with me. These four quadrants or the 4 corners here, this is not what we mean by 4 fields, but rather just a bit of orientation for me for the next few minutes. If I were to scroll forward, this top right, the top left, as I look at my screen, we call the incubator or the hive model. Do you see that? if I just took a minute to describe this model, I would say on the left, the larger circle, a pre-existing church that has each dot being a member of that church and pre-existing leaders, sometimes by a demographic study, sometimes by a even residential mapping. They might at times, with a vision for church planting, draw a circle around a percentage of their congregation and do a bit of a incubator model for church planting. They're gonna, maybe they know that there's 2 neighborhoods or a suburb of the city where they reside that 10, 15 families live and are commuting from that area. So inside their pre-existing church, they're going to put a circle around them, going to introduce them. They're going to begin to envision them to be body life. They're going to identify a leader. And in this church planting model, at the right time, they might hive or launch out what's been incubated inside the pre-existing church to land in said community and start almost like a fully orbed church plant from day one. Does that make sense? An incubator model. If that makes sense to you guys, a few of you raise your hand. You see the incubator model? Okay. Here's a second church planting model. Okay. This one I just call the assessment model. Now, my dad's been involved in this model serially. My dad being a church planter in Arizona and much of my adult life. Where there in the top left, I assume it's the left on your screen as well, maybe a number of different churches come together with a vision to cooperate to empower church planting. They go through an assessment process, maybe even a pool of candidates. They identify a candidate that fits their process. Presumably, I hear in the drawing a married couple. They vet that candidate, they equip that candidate, and presumably back that candidate as they identify a target church planting field, send them out, and distinct in this model, the church planter typically works a planter to pastor model, planter to elder model in leadership of the church plant over time. So again, just quickly, a few hands in the room, that made sense. You've seen this model at work? Okay. If I move back down across the floor, a third model, we call this one membership squared. Okay. So we've got the pre-existing church, the larger circle there on the left. And this time they're inside, similar to the incubator model, a pre-existing believer might be identified, an individual rather than a group that might hive together. Rather, an individual is identified, perhaps equipped, trained, mentored to be about church planting inside a pre-existing church. And then distinct in this model as they're mentored in an ongoing relationship, their commitment to the pre-existing church, they also are sent out to establish a second generation church. They may or may not become the leader, elder, overseer of that second generation church, but distinct in this model, they might remain members of both. A church where they're mentored, a church that they are leading out and even planting. In which case, that second generation church, the dots, the members of that second generation church, presumably aren't introduced back to the pre-existing, but rather the churches might be autonomous. The church planter might be member of both. One where they're mentored, one where they're planting. Anybody, does that make sense? Anybody see this model before? Maybe fewer hands, but it makes sense anyway, right? Okay, I imagine there might even be some ecclesiological questions about the notion of being members and committed at 2 at once, but okay, we keep moving forward. This one we're going to call an HOP or an MOP model. Yeah.
Well, you got to ask a quick question about that previous one.
Yeah.
Sure.
Is that, would that be similar to like a multi-site model?
Okay. Good question. I could see multi-site in this, but distinct in this setting, the second generation church I've suggested isn't connected. The members may most likely never involved with the previous generation. Now, when you mentioned multi-site, let me go back to this model. That was the first one we looked at, the incubator. And many times you can see this model being a campus model, right? The question is, inside the pre-existing, they've identified, even gotten to a ready-made incubated church start complete with leaders who are sent out. Many times this is the campus model. What would be distinct of a campus or a multi-site model is that the arrow is never erased. They remain connected, right? Maybe in budgeting, maybe in accountability or leadership. Most likely this is your model for a multi-site in my hypothetical models drawings here, okay? Great question. So
That's
we're
great.
back to that fourth example, and then we're going to ask about a dozen questions about these models, okay? This one, lack of a better term, a house of peace or a man of peace model, where you see the pre-existing church there up in the far left in the corner, presumably a 2x2, whether it's a couple or a couple, two male single church planners, whoever it might be, sent out, empowered, perhaps itinerating for the sake of church planning. They might come, they might land on a house of peace, a man of peace. You might be familiar with some of the conversations around Luke 10 or Acts chapter 10 as Peter and his companions went to Cornelius's house. And in this case, rather than assuming leadership, the 2x2 church planners both enter, but from the beginning have the intention of exiting as well, so that they might continue to itinerate. In which case, the church plant actually forms around that man of peace. The new leadership for the new church emerges from the harvest. As a bit of a spoiler, if you will, this could be called a Cornelius model. Peter and his companions go to Caesarea. They engage Cornelius's household, but they stay only for a few days. And we don't have it said that became the church in Caesarea, but thereafter we have reference to the church of God in Caesarea. And so the assumption might be that Cornelius became the stackpole for what would become a church plant, a new leader emerging for the new church from the harvest. Okay, does that model make sense? Not that you've necessarily seen it in action, but what I've explained. Any question about that? Those then are
We
four.
Got a quick question on that.
Go ahead.
The HOP model, is that kind of like apostolic church planting?
Okay, great question. So now I've come back to that screen that shows all four, correct? The two at the top, across the top, the incubator and the assessment model, very common in the West. As I said, my father involved primarily in that assessment model of church planting, okay? The IMB's sister organization, North American Mission Board, NAM, very involved in that second model, the assessment model of church planting. Oftentimes, the two on the top would be referred to as a pastoral model or an ecclesial-centric model. That is the churches planting churches, right? And below the line, the two across the bottom, to your question, often in a pioneering set by guys like J.D. Payne and others, apostolic church planting. These would be referred to as a apostolic model across the bottom. Okay, a missional model, a church, missional driven, missiology driven type of model. Okay, now my first question for you guys then would be, which one of these four is God using? And before you answer, this is the one question I'm going to answer for you. And because I think it matters as much as any of the rest of our conversation, the answer is all of them. I hope that answer is palatable for the room. Which one of these models is God using around the world? All of them. Okay. What I want to do is just, again, I'm going to ask you to give me a show of hands and keep your hand up for a second so I can see you in case there's a little bit of delay. Any of these models, or let me say it this way, My question is, which one of these models have you personally been involved with, or for that matter, are currently practicing? Okay. How many of you, by a show of hands, would consider that incubator model, the hiving model, the first one we went over, the default model that you practice for church planning? Okay, I see about at least half the room. Is that right? Not everybody, but most. Okay. Okay. Raise your hand and keep it up if the assessment model, you've had experience or you're currently practicing the assessment model of church planning. Okay. Not sure what I did just then, but I lost it. Okay, there we go. What about the, now I can't see the screen, but you guys still can, right? How about the membership squared? Anybody using that model or been exposed to that model? Okay. Perfect. Let's see, that was Colin raising your hand. Is that right, Colin? Good. And what about that last one, the House of Peace or Man of Peace model? Anybody done that, been involved with that? Okay. Well, that does help me. You can imagine why, now, as I started, these models are going to be nuanced. And most likely, if I asked you to diagram your model, it's totally on the script to have some combination of any two of these. But for the sake of our conversation, getting an idea around the room, what to expect or how I might challenge you, understand the way your experience over these years of service, these four models, it seems to me, are the basic working models around the world. Nuanced, maybe combinations, but God is using every one of these models around the world. Now, the vast majority of you put your hands up for the top two. One of the top two. And I called those a pastoral model. In that many times, whether it's pre-existing, assessed, elder qualified, elder equipped, and then the one who is sent out or the one who leads those sent out is presumably going to step from a planter to a pastor model. Again, I'm not criticizing my dad, I assure you. That's the model that he's been involved in much of my adult life, and God's using that particularly around the West, the United States, particularly. What's interesting, someone asked the two below the line or even the House of Peace model. I would call both of those below the line the presumption that over time, maybe an apostolic or a sent one model, maybe a missionary model, typically involved in pioneering settings, in settings where either the harvest field or the harvest force resources might be limited. And so reproducibility has driven the church planner or the selection of the church planning model in some ways, because the truth is, in many cases, the resources required for these four different models vary, don't they? So here's what I want to do. I just want to ask you guys to consider the strengths and liabilities of each model. And let me say it again. Let's have a discussion around the perceived strengths and liabilities of each model. Starting with the incubator model, that I hope you don't mind me calling it that. I think it's meant to be a compliment. The incubator model used by a lot in the West and a lot even around this room. What would be the perceived strengths of such a model for church planning? Anybody that wants to throw in on that? Why don't you jump in? That was Colin sitting in the middle there. Colin, go ahead, brother.
Chris here.
Chris.
That's all right. Yeah. I think we get
I wrote you down based on where you're sitting. So if you want to move around a lot, you're really going to get me. Chris, go ahead. Bro.
Yeah, we shifted on you. It's not you, it's
Okay.
us. Yeah, team gets the opportunity to build trust with one another before they go out. Teams doing it together. That seems, like some pros.
Excellent. So even you might, in that pre-launch phase, you might work out some of the body life issues. Have an idea that the eye would never say to the hand. I mean, 1 Corinthians 12 in practicum, right? Even before launching out, that's good. Somebody else on the strength of that model? There's a hand on the far right. Is that Jonathan from Utah? Thanks for keeping your chair.
Yeah, of course. I'd say that model, there's shared culture that
Okay.
whether, I mean, I would say it's a strength usually, but I guess it could be
Yeah.
but
Yeah. And if I described it well, Jonathan, to my point, a lot of times by a demographic or even a geographic mapping of a suburb, for example, whether it's campus or you intend that to be released and be autonomous, second generation, presumably they have some shared demographic. They would be insiders in the presumed church planting field. They reside there. If that's the case, then if not same culture, near culture, residential church planting, and that they are planted in that community, that's good. That's a strength. Somebody else? Was there one on the left there? Was that that's not Carson, that's Matthew in the recliner, right?
That's right.
Was Matthew raising his hand?
Oh, I'll say so, sure. It seems like you just a strong connection to the sending church, from the sending church.
Yeah, good. Good. So what's needed for accountability, even financing, there's going to be some, even the reproduction of a particular model and fidelity to said model or standard of preaching and teaching and church function, that accountability that's involved, even we might say that there's stability, right? In the sense of a model for the church planner. Typically, they've got a pretty steady stream even of the financial commitments when they launch, if that's rent for the building or even potentially a salary. Sure, even if they're scaling that salary over time toward release, the church planner sleeps pretty well. It can sleep pretty well at night knowing there's some backing, not just financially, but mentoring and go-to for ongoing challenge and problem solving, right? And for that matter, a group of believers around them provides stability, a core team type of group around them that also have vision and desire to be about a church plant. All right, here's a tougher question. Most of you in the room and in the good, the bad, and the ugly of church planting, I'll be taking notes. Any liabilities in that model?
We've been talking about it a decent amount today. You can, quote unquote, weaken the sending church by taking a large chunk of people.
Again, we're talking about perceived liabilities, right? So that's true. People perceive, and a lot of times, even in that first generation church, you're telling me to give up the best disciple makers, those equipped and qualified that we vetted for sending out. We're giving up our best in some cases, right? And so might work against the job description of the pastor of the pre-existing generation if they're giving up their best evangelists or disciple makers to go and start again. All right. I like J.D. I've never read it. I say I like it. I like the title of J.D. Greer's book. What is it? Gaining by Losing. I maybe because I like 2 Corinthians 9. Seed to the sower. That you can be generous on every occasion and the giving of offering for that. I think that applies to leadership acumen as well. We send out, creating a vacuum for others to stand up, or for that matter, as we give the best and push out the best. So it's a perceived liability. Agreed. Someone else? Liabilities?
It might make it more difficult to contextualize your sending place when you're bringing the culture with you.
Keith, can you repeat that for me? I think that's Ben, right, from Oregon?
That was Jordan, and he was saying it could be
Jordan.
a liability to be contextual since you're bringing the culture with you.
Oh, okay. A liability to contextualization, because it does have a pretty set ethos. Even that pre-existing model is going to set the bar for what's expected, even among those believers who go out to help start. A standard of teaching, a polish or professionalism of worship or childcare or building style, All of those things come along as culture and presumption, right? Thank you for that, Jordan. Sorry about that. Ben behind you. Any others you want to jump in on? How about cost? Now I'm in a pioneering setting where we have literally 2 billion population target that we're seeking to church plan and strategize for. But for that matter, 1,700 different languages spoken, different valleys and bazaars, marketplaces around South Asia. But that population's multiplying. You know, a lot of times, right or wrong, and I'm sure it can morph more and less efficient over time, but that pre-existing model, that pre-existing church at times sets a standard also in professionalism and the assumptions, presumptions, not just of the team planting, but of the audience being served or being ministered to. A lot of times that comes with a pretty hefty price tag, doesn't it? Is that okay to say? Usually we're talking about an incubator model running a 6-figure price tag. And that's possible, doable, replicatable. It's being used by God, but at times cost could be a liability. How about the second one, the assessment model? Give me some perceived strengths, and we'll just throw it in together this time, or liabilities of the assessment model. You remember what that looked like? It's up there in the top right if I'm still sharing my screen. A few churches work together, identify a candidate, send a candidate out to plant church, and presumably the planter becomes the pastor.
Yeah, it can be different to build trust between the churches and the candidate. Wasn't necessarily raised up internally and all that.
Okay. So to build trust, that is with the assessing team, the funding base, or with the new context and harvest field? Both, right?
I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this often was referenced as like maybe like a parachuting,
Parachuting?
sending people out to aim, because they don't. You could send. Could be.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's going to be both. I didn't understand whether that was strength or liability, but I could see how it could be either. Right? Who was it that was in Utah? Okay. My guess is probably not an incubator model in Utah, a campus model in Utah. Maybe I'm wrong, but in a little bit more pioneering context among Mormons of Utah, most likely the church assessment team that sends you out, if it was an assessment model, would be a little bit further removed. So this assessment model might allow us to plant at a further distance, a further geographic distance, even send someone across a state line to a place like Salt Lake and plant there. And then you've got that question. If you're further removed from the sending base and the accountability than you would be with an incubator model or a campus model, you're further away from that support base, perhaps. There might be some isolation issues along the way. And then in a context not your own, like a Salt Lake City, if your target harvest field are primarily Mormons, there are going to be some trust issues. There's going to be some contextualization issues. There's going to be some barriers to cross with that gospel because we're not talking about engaging in a church context, right? Strengths and liabilities in that paragraph. In some cases, the same thing might be perceived as both. Some might describe it as a strength, some might describe it as a liability. Okay. The point is then we can find and we can dig out strengths and liabilities for all 4 models. Now, here's my question. I want somebody to give me a specific liability for pick one of the 2 models on the lower half of the page. What concerns you about either of these models? What liabilities would we see in either the membership squared or the House of Peace model? Can I give one just to break the ice? In the membership squared model, I'm a Baptist. I like autonomous churches. I like to see what we plant actually be able to stand on its own, actually be able to stand and no longer need the mother church or the previous generation to provide support and leadership. And there's times when if that leader never is committed to both, those allegiances might be divided or even become fuzzy in a way that stunts autonomy. There's the liability, right? Just to prove to you that liabilities are on the table, somebody else give me a liability from one of those models on the below the line.
Yeah, like I said, I was a missionary in East Asia. There's always questions of like, that's not even a church. Like you don't have a good ecclesiological structure. You don't have a pastor yet, so you can't be a
Okay.
church.
Okay.
You can't be a church.
Good. So particularly the House of Peace model, I described it even as a Cornelius type of scenario. How can they be a church without a shepherd? How can they be a flock without a shepherd? It might ask us perceived weakness or perceived liability. Agreed. Might lead us to discuss a little bit of the chicken or the egg when it comes to shepherd and a flock. Which comes first? It's not exactly chicken or the egg question. Like it doesn't matter. A flock without a shepherd has a tendency to scatter. Meanwhile, the sheep don't draw their identity from the existence of a shepherd, but the shepherd does draw his existence or his identity from the existence of a flock. So it's not exactly a which comes first, which comes second. If you're calling yourself a shepherd, but there's no flock, there's another synonym, might be charlatan. I don't know. You ever meet people going around introducing themselves as a pastor, but when you ask, can I meet your sheep? They don't have an answer. I'm not sure they're really a pastor, right? Leading sheep to pasture, Old English pastor, right? So, okay. Good question. Good point. Perceived liability, instability. You saying starting new churches with new believers? Is that advisable? We have in the incubator model some presumption of a core that's more matured or they've been through a maturation and incubation process. We might rightly perceive stability as a strength. And if that's the case, we look at the opposite corner of that House of Peace model and say instability might be the liability of it. Anybody else? Liabilities below the line?
I think one could be like just needing a person with a lot of grit in that House of Peace model.
Okay.
It can be lonelier and all those sort of things. So just different than the incubator model in that way.
Okay. In that man of peace, that House of Peace, whoever is going to land as that stackpole, gather their community around them and become the church planter, become the pastor over time, the elder at the right time, become the stackpole for a new church, even as a new believer, presumably some grit. Okay, I appreciate that. That you gave it maybe that's a strength. Or maybe that's a small percentage, in which case that might be a liability, right? Because very few would make it through that scenario. Okay. Anybody else? One more? All right. Any strengths below the line?
It's faster. It's
Did you say faster?
yeah, it can multiply simpler.
Okay. Carries the potential for reproducibility in that it's simpler. It requires less foreign or outside investment. Okay. Again, that might be perceived as instability, but it also might be perceived as reproducibility. Anybody choking on those words so far?
I think you mentioned with the House of Peace, like new churches are starting with new Christians. I think in Resonate over the years, we've seen that be a strength that maybe other models have thought it's less so, but they just don't have some of the baggage, like, oh, it has to be this way, or disciple people from the beginning, and it's been really, I think, cool for our churches. So
Yeah. So I would even want to say, let me see if I look back at my chart here. That was Matt, right? Matt? Because Chris joined the couch. I got it, Chris, with the gray sweatshirt. Thanks a lot, brother. Hey, Colin in the middle still, maybe? I don't know. But Matt said, reproducibility. You realize, starting with new believers, you realize that assessment model, top right again, it could be reproducible. It could start new churches with new believers, even if the planter becomes the pastor. But you realize again in the reproducibility, we're not just talking about the model itself, but the time of and commitment of the church planter. So what's unique in the House of Peace is that they both enter to start, but then form that church around the host, around the new believer, the Cornelius figure, if you will. And then they also have the chance to reproduce the model themselves. Whereas typically in the assessment model, the planter becomes the pastor, remains on there. Rarely do you see an assessment model become a serial church planter. Typically, they develop ministry over, even might consider fidelity, the ability to stay there for decades, right? As opposed to the House of Peace model, where Peter and his traveling companions in Acts 10, just go to straight to it, stayed for a few days, is what it says in Acts 10, and then returned to Jerusalem. In which case, the question becomes, are we able to reproduce even the time of the church planter themselves? Is it possible that one church planter might be involved in multiple church plants over the next decade? Some of these models are conducive to that posture, a serial church planter, if you will. Some of these models assume something different. Now, North American Mission Board again. Here's an IMBer picking on the North American Mission Board. Not really. God's using them. But over the years of time, it used to be 7 years. An assessed church planter might have 7 years of funding. And over those years of time, the funding from the North American Mission Board would phase out under the presumption that the funding of the local church would increase, or 5 years, or 3 years, or I'm not sure exactly what the model is currently under new leadership this last decade. But you see, even in that model, the assumption that the planter, if he's going to feed his kids, the planter would naturally assume the pastoral role, because that's where the funding will come from. The local church is not going to pay him to plant, they're going to pay him to pastor. And so even institutionally, we might have set up models that lead from a planter to pastor model. And God's using it. It makes it more and more difficult for the planter to carry on and continue church planting if they assume the elder overseer role of a single church, right? In which case, multiplication would be a little longer play, as that church maybe takes up example number 1 and incubates or becomes part of an assessment process for others. There's other ways to reproduce, but maybe the strength or liabilities involved. Now, here's all of this conversation is meant to platform. Obviously, in an hour, we're not exhausting any of these questions. But my goal in this first hour to get to know you guys a little bit, the breadth of your experience, some of you 17, 19 years of ministry. No doubt you've seen fruit. God's used you. You're successful. Regardless of the model you've chosen, God's used you. So I'm not questioning that at all, but I am going to ask you another question. And honestly, it's the $10 million question. Which of these models can we demonstrate scripturally? If I had more time today, I'd put you in twos. I'd let you pick one of the models, and I imagine we'd have some pretty articulate defenses of the various models that are here. But I'll just point out to you, and it's okay that when we read the book of Acts, when we consider the epistle ministry of Paul and other apostles there in the New Testament, they were universally working in pioneer contexts. In which case, there's got to be room for a church context, a context whereby model number 1 and number 2 come on the radar, where even churches are responsible for identifying and planting other churches, identifying church planters. So it's not criticism. But I will tell you, as I read it, the 2 clearest examples here among these models that we can see in the New Testament are on the bottom half of the page. The membership squared model. Consider for a second Acts chapter 2. 3,000, Acts 2:41, accepted the message, were baptized, and 3,000 were added to their day, that number, added to their number that day. In Acts 2:42, they devoted themselves to the apostle teaching, to prayer, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and they met house to house. Well, man, I love Roger Gehring. If you've never seen House Church and Mission, he says the average archaeological dig in the first century in the whole area of Judea says 30 people. The average house, a middle class, a nice home in Jerusalem might have been able to hold 30 people. So when they put 3,000 people meeting homes daily, breaking bread, having Lord's Supper, and devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, yeah, they met publicly in the temple, but they met house to house. Okay, 30 people per house, 3,000 house. They organized 100 homes right there in the immediate context to host church planting, to host the functions of church in their embryonic form, if you want to say it so, in Acts chapter 2. That's our DNA. They were meeting publicly to be mentored. They were meeting house to house to practice what they were learning, and the Lord continued to add to their number daily. I think that membership squared model could be demonstrated. It gets more and more difficult to demonstrate once you get past Antioch. Now, we could call Antioch an assessment model, I suppose, as long as we acknowledge the one doing the selection was the Holy Spirit of God. Acts 13:2, while they were praying and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them. In which case, let me stop sharing. If I can look you a little closer in the eye, is that all right? Now I can get my beady eye up there on the screen a little better. Is that okay? You got me, right? After Acts 13, we could call it an assessment model. They're sent out 2 by 2, but you notice that Paul, Barnabas, hey, let's go on down the list of 100 co-workers: Timothy, Titus, Silas, Epaphras, Priscilla and Aquila, Andronicus, Eutychus, you name it. Tychicus, Trophimus, Secundus. There's 100 names associated with Paul. Do you realize, now I'm really pushing you for just a second, you realize none of them are ever referred to as elder, overseer, shepherd? Paul can go back in Acts 14:23 to a city like Lystra and appoint elders in Lystra and all the churches of Galatia. He's willing to go back to places they tried to kill him to make sure elders are appointed. That mattered to Paul. And in fact, like Titus 1, verse 5, Paul says to Titus, the reason I left you in Crete was to finish the work that was undone and appoint elders in all the towns. So elder appointment mattered intensely to Paul. Fascinating then that none of those co-workers, none of those names associated with Paul are ever actually seen or referenced having assumed that role. So the church in Philippi stackpoled around Lydia or the jailer? And the church in Caesarea, we said around Cornelius. Really, Peter? A few days and then you return to Jerusalem? That doesn't sound like some of our preference for stability. The church in Corinth around Crispus, Gaius, the household of Stephanus, take your pick. Acts 18 and 1 Corinthians 1, Paul baptized those names. And then he doesn't remember if he baptized anyone. Paul says in verse 17 of 1 Corinthians 1, God didn't send me to baptize, but to preach. 1 Corinthians 3, I laid a foundation, someone else is building on it. 1 Corinthians 3. So around whom did the Corinthian church start? Well, presumably it started around new believers. And the leaders emerged from the harvest. You realize now I'm making arguments from silence. You can call me on it if you want, but there's no example anywhere of an elder, overseer, shepherd moving from one field to another. Presumably because that very title is drawn an identity from the existence of commitment to a particular flock. Meanwhile, the sent ones, another word there in the New Testament, synergos, ergon is the work, and synergos means one carrying on the work just as Paul was. 38 of the names associated with Paul are referred to as co-workers. And none of them presumably assuming the role. Doesn't mean that they weren't pastoral. There had to be some example and model demonstrated. But universally, where we see elders, overseers emerge, whether it's Ephesus or Philippians 1:1 and 2, or 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, even the qualifications, presumably those qualifications and those elders were emerging from the harvest. In which case, that house of peace, that membership squared model, those below the line, we can demonstrate serially over and over again across the New Testament. Is there still room for those models? I asked you at the beginning, and I realize it's a little bit of me being tricky, a little bit of Zoom ninjery maybe, to ask you guys to declare which one of these models are you've been used to and been involved with. Most of you raise your hand on one of the first two. Very few number in the second half of these models, number 3 and 4. If those are the models we actually see in Scripture, is there room for those models? Would we consider them as examples? Here's the truth, and I realize we're going to go to Q&A right now. One more show of hands. You don't have to invite me back if you don't want to. I get it. You started as fans. We'll see if that's true in 5 minutes. Show of hands. How many of you are World War I veterans? Yeah, well, I could have predicted that, right? World War I, the last generation of Americans to see church growth keep up with population growth. World War I generation. And we're using models that God's using. We're committed to being used by God. We're assuming fidelity where you stepped into pastoral ministry, just like my dad. I'm not criticizing my dad, but I do have questions about reproducibility. I do have questions about even the scope and scale of the harvest field that we might be engaging. And I certainly have questions about biblical examples that should be on the table. Are we willing to pursue them, or do we have a preference for certain stability? If you do, you might have big problems with the Apostle Paul when you consider 1 Corinthians, the letter. If you make a list of church functions you think the groom expects of the bride, 1 Corinthians is not going to meet your standard. That's why the letter exists, right? Because there was all kinds of abuse with Lord's Supper and infidelity and sin issues and the need for church discipline and excesses in spiritual gifts and false teaching regarding resurrection and lawsuits and you name it. That's 1 Corinthians. It's not okay that those things exist. The 1 Corinthians letter was needed. Why did 1 Corinthians exist? Why do we have 1 Corinthians letter? If anybody's got a Bible, look up 1 Corinthians 16, verse 8 and 9. Paul says, but I intend to stay on in Ephesus until Pentecost, for the Lord has opened a great door for effective work, and there are many who oppose me. You can tell me, is that verse number 8 or verse number 9? 1 Corinthians 16. We have 1 Corinthians as a letter specifically because when Paul heard of the problems, he didn't drop everything to go fix it himself. We have 1 Corinthians because Paul was prioritizing the open door of effective pioneering in Ephesus, Acts chapter 19. In which case, in absentia, the epistles exist. The epistles give the standard for church planting across that we must hold up, absolutely. And we have the epistles specifically because Paul continued to release and itinerate and call the Corinthians to responsibility. Whew. That makes me nervous. That makes me anxious about fidelity and stability. When was the last time you read the New Testament? It didn't make you a little bit anxious. It didn't actually get under your skin a little bit. Is it okay that the Bible challenges our models? Is it okay that it challenges assumptions about fidelity and stability? Sure seems like risk. Good thing Paul could write so clearly about sovereignty then, huh? Aren't we glad for his writing in Romans 9 and Romans 8 and elsewhere? Oh, just checking to see if there's any reform voices in the room. Hey, that's the guy who wrote about God will do it in Philippians 1. He'll carry on to completion. In Thessalonians 5, he'll keep you strong to the end. In 1 Corinthians 1, how could he go to sleep at night knowing that the Corinthians or the Thessalonians were such a mess, or the Thessalonians like orphans left when he was torn away? Well, his plan in that case was to send Timothy back. 1 Corinthians 3:1, when we could stand it no longer, we thought it best to be left ourselves in Athens. We sent Timothy. Oh, okay, got it. When they were facing persecution and when they were struggling with all kinds of infancy issues, and it even says in the end of chapter 2, Satan blocked their way. They're opposed, but even by the enemy, their plan was to send the teenager to see about their faith, hope, and love. Yeah, good church planning plan, Paul. That make anybody nervous or just me? It might be harder to release churches than it is to start churches. All right, I'll be quiet. Any questions or thoughts on this? Any feedback for me? Are you willing to consider some other models? If you are, then Keith, I suppose maybe this is all a commercial for maybe I get an invite back sometime. But maybe not.
This is really helpful, Nathan.
Okay. I would hope that it spurs a lot of conversations around lunch and dinner. And if this is retreat, maybe some Bible studies, obviously, also. Dig in there and see if that's accurate related to Corinthians or Thessalonians or Acts 10. But if we're a generation that hasn't seen church growth keep up with population growth, are we open to biblical models? Are we open to reconsider and reread? Surely. I'm talking to brothers whose lives are committed to this. By no means a first reading. Simply said, we'll never be done reading. That's my hope and goal for you guys, as the Lord leads you by his Spirit and his word, okay? Any questions for me today? Keith, what do you think?
Yeah, Nathan, that's really challenging, really helpful. I think we've probably experienced all four of these in some sense in our history.
Right.
Examples.
Probably even some combinations of the different types, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Elements of all four. I'm curious, when you go back to the scripture and the narrative throughout the New Testament, how do you discern narrative versus normative? Like, what are the principles for all time, the patterns that God expects to see throughout history versus unique things in Paul's ministry and that season of the church?
Okay, so that's Colin right there in the middle with the hat, right? Yeah.
Great.
Well, so Colin is asking the question related to genre of scripture. You guys may be familiar, maybe you've had a lot of conversations on the same topic. We would not want to say that the narratives are normative for all time and all place, in part because there's a number of things that are unique to the first century, a few things that as they're replicated or presumed to be replicated even today, might exist in excess. I can think of a few charismatic issues, for example, that claim to be reproductions of Acts 2 or the gift of tongues and other things, and not sure we want to vouch for everything. So if we called it normative, then wouldn't every generation need to do all and practice all those healings and resurrections? And I get it. I'm going to say to you, brother, let me give you reoccurrence and coalescence, two nice big words, right? Where I do think that Luke, as the writer of Acts, as our example narrative for just a moment, has theological purposes, missiological, related to the mission established among the ethne, the Gentiles, so that as Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, so Peter and the other apostles, as Jesus and Peter and the other apostles, so also Paul, that there's certain principles that reoccur, that maybe even coalesce across all three of these ministries, Jesus, Peter, and the apostles, and then Paul, to demonstrate the fidelity, to demonstrate the legitimacy of the Gentile mission. Well, there's a few places where he even calls it the work of mission, the work the Holy Spirit sent, Acts 13:2, the work they had fulfilled, completed, accomplished, Acts 14:26. I think that Luke is demonstrable. He had theological and missiological purposes in some of what he wrote. But we would be looking for principles, and we would define the weight of those principles based on reoccurrence, and coalescence. Not just the examples of Jesus, Peter, and Paul, but even within the Pauline corpus, the examples of Paul in Acts coalescing with the mandates, the imperatives of his epistles. In which case, there's certain things in the epistolary genre we see backing, confirming, expecting much of what we see as examples in the narrative. That's my $5 answer to a $100 question. Okay? Good question.
That's good. What else?
Did I stir it up enough to get you guys talking over lunch?
Yeah.
That's good.
All
Hey, what I enjoy asking, what's the question that you think we should be asking you?
Okay, I got two for you. This'll kind of shape some of the liability and strength question. Again, it has to do, remember, I'm talking about a pioneering field in South Asia where the scope demands of our assignment meet more than 2,300 people groups that we seek to establish and launch strategy over. And we consider it a life's work also. But we're not talking about, even as I pursue church planting and am involved as a church planter, my goal isn't to plant a church, it's to see multiplying churches among all those people groups. Now, I mentioned earlier the stewardship of controllable and uncontrollable, and I sleep just well at night, being able to give much of that back to God every day, right? Things only He can do. That said, here's two questions to discuss. Is it possible in the United States, okay? In the United States, is it possible to start new churches with zero budget? There's a question for you guys to wrestle with. If it was the actual default, which model would you choose? Secondly, is it possible to start new churches purely with new believers? Means we win Cornelius and his household and the Caesarean church is born. Presumably the eventual elder overseers emerge from that harvest. Is that possible? Maybe, maybe not. Be careful if it's maybe not in the West that we've taken off most of the examples, the universal examples. Hear me saying examples from narrative again, Colin, right? If it's not possible, we've taken off the examples off the table that make up our New Testament. And again, the caveat, all those fields across the New Testament were pioneer. Okay, so it's not the only model. My question is it possible?
That's a helpful framework. Thank you.
All right. Well, you can imagine not actually being in the room, trying to read the room, trying to look close enough to see, is there a smile or is there a grimace? I assume I pushed you just about as hard as I could today. Nobody fell off a cliff or anything. Nobody threw a chair at the screen. So I guess we're good. Maybe I didn't push hard enough. I don't know. But brothers, the work you're doing is worth your life. You started out saying we're fan. Let me tell you, I'm a fan of you guys. Just like I am of my dad. Giving yourselves over fully, your families, your plans, your futures to see the kingdom established among peoples who don't know. Brothers, that's New Testament. That's well done, good and faithful servants, and expect to hear it as you walk into the kingdom. And it's a pleasure to meet you all, okay? I hope this came across as fellowship.
Yeah, I think we believe that 100%. So just want to say thank you, Nathan, for your time. And we'd love to continue some of this dialogue as we chew on it. Hopefully we can have a part 2 of this conversation.
Yeah,
and, so
I'd like it.
So 100% welcome back. So we'll do that. Thank you again for your time. And man, we just really appreciate you. So excited to be able to have examples for what you guys are doing over in South Asia. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
As we relate through Brother Keith Evans, there's time, maybe even a vision trip to come spend a little time in South Asia, and we'll actually show you what we do teach, okay? Along the way. It's a pleasure.
Great. Thank
God
you.
bless you.